Welcome back to MonsterTamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created Phaser 3. Previously, for our cutscenes and in-game events feature, we worked on updating our world scene to add our new zone game objects, and we made these configurable so we can see them in our scene. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links in the video description to the source code to this point, as well as a complete source code for this video. There'll also be links to the previous videos you'd like to catch up, so let's get started. So now that we have our new event zone game objects in our scene, and we're able to see them so we can test, now we need to update our world scene to check for overlaps between our player game object and one of our event zones. So what we'll end up doing is when our player moves, after we finish moving, we're going to see if our player sprite, our game object, now overlaps with one of our event zones. And so to do this check, we're going to be using a built-in Phaser utility method for taking the two shapes of our game objects and then checking to see if they intersect. And if they do, then we'll go ahead and that'll be our trigger to start our cutscene. For the time being, we're just going to log a message just to make sure our logic is working. And so how this utility method works is we need to grab our shapes of our two game objects we want to compare. So like the rectangle of our player and our rectangle of our event zone game object. And then we need to store, and then we need to call this method, and Phaser will store the results in a new game object. This game object will represent a rectangle, and it'll have things like our X and Y, our width and height, and it'll tell us how much of an overlap there is between our two game objects. And if there is no overlap, then our shape won't change, and it'll have a size of 0. And so for our check, because for our player, we want to check our rectangle against multiple event zones, we'll need to loop through them. We're going to store this on a new game object. That way it'll be reusable and we don't have to recreate one every single time we're doing this update check. So to get started with our code changes, let's jump into our world scene. Let's come up to the top of our class. We're going to add a few new properties so we can keep track of these game objects. And so we need to create 3 different game objects. We'll need a rectangle for our player shape, a rectangle to represent the event zone we're checking, and then we need that rectangle that stores that result. So for this, we'll call them rectangle for overlap check 1. And I'm just going to copy one of our type definitions here. We're going to paste it. And then for our type, it's going to be a phaser, geometry, and then a rectangle. So I'm going to copy this and we'll paste it twice. So we'll have our rectangle for overlap check 2. And now this one will be our rectangle overlap result. And so now we'll need to create our new game objects. So first, let's go to our init method. We're going to set them to be undefined, so we reset them between our scene restarts. So we'll do this. We'll do our rectangle for overlap check 1 will be equal to undefined. Let's copy that line. We'll paste it twice. And we'll do our rectangle for overlap check 2 and our rectangle overlap results. So now if we come down to our create method, let's go ahead and create our rectangles. So let's do our first rectangle, and we'll set equal to a new phaser geometry rectangle. And so this is going to create a new instance of our phaser geometry rectangle class. And when we don't provide any arguments, by default, our rectangle will have a default position of 0, 0, and our width and height will be 0. And so for our use case, this will work for the time being, since we don't actually want to update our rectangle's position until after our player moves, then we want our new X and Y value. Now we want to do the same thing for our other 2 game objects. So let's just copy and paste that twice. We'll do our rectangle for overlap check 2, and we'll have a rectangle overlap result, and let's save. So now that we have our new game objects, now after our player moves, we now need to do that check. So let's come down to our handle player movement update method. All right, so right after we update our player's position in our data manager, now we'll do our check to see if we're in one of our event zones. So after our players move, we want that to be our trigger first and foremost. And so we want to do this before any of our other checks. All right, so now we need to loop through all of our event zones. To do this, we want to grab all of our values from our event zone game object. So let's do for, we'll do const zone of our object.values. And now we're going to do this, and we'll do our event zones. And so for our IntelliSense error here, this is just because of our JS config and what we're targeting for our lib. Currently we have ES 2016, and so this wasn't available then, so we'll need to update that. If we jump over to our JS config, all we need to do is just pass in ES 2017, and so we'll be targeting that library. And now if we save, and so now we'll see our error goes away. All right, so now to see if our player overlaps with our event zone, we need to use phaser geometry, then we'll do intersects, and now we want to do get rectangle intersection. Now, so for this method, this is where we need to provide our 3 rectangles that we want to check for that intersection on. So the first will be our first game object, so this will be our player. So let's do this dot rectangle for overlap check 1. Now we want to do our other ones. We'll do this rectangle for overlap check 2. And then our last argument is where we're going to store the results of this check. And so this will be our rectangle overlap result. All right, so what this utility method does is we provide our 2 game objects we want to check for an overlap with. So for both of our rectangles, it'll use our X and Y position and their width and heights to see if they have that intersection at all. If there is a result, it's going to update our game object we provide here with the X and Y position and then the width and height of that intersection rectangle. And so for this method to work, we need to update our two rectangle game objects to use our actual position, width, and height of both our player and the event zone that we want to check for. So let's start with our player. So for our player, let's do this outside our for loop because after our player moves, it won't actually change. And so for our player, let's reference our player. Next, let's reference our sprite game object from our player, and then we're going to use the getBounds method. So what this method does is we can provide it one of our geometry rectangles. If we do, it's going to update that rectangle to have the same exact position and the same width and height of our player's body for our sprite's game object. So if we provide this, and then we do our rectangle for overlap check 1, this will make sure it updates that rectangle. So as an example, I'm just going to copy this real quick. We're going to do console.log before, and then we'll do after. So if we save, let's come into our scene. All right, so if we refresh our browser, let's move our player. We're going to see in our console that for our rectangle, it has the initial properties of when we created it. And so since we didn't provide any arguments, it was at position 0, 0, and it did not have a width or height. After we move our player, we can now see our rectangle's been updated. It now has our player's position and our player's width and height for our game object. And as we move our player around our scene, we'll see that our X and Y values are going to change depending on our player's new position. Since we're not changing our sprite size at all, our width and height will stay the same. So now we want to do a similar thing for our second rectangle, and this one's going to be matched up with our event zone. So let's copy this line of code here. We'll come above our code here, let's paste it. So now instead of our player, we want to do our zone game object, and we'll call getBounds, and now we want to pass in our second rectangle. So now this will update our second rectangle to have the position and our width and height of whichever zone we're checking for. All right, so one last thing we need to do is we need to reset the size on our rectangle overlap result rectangle before we call getRectangleIntersection. And the reason for that is when we invoke this method, if there's no intersection for our two rectangles, then the original rectangle we provided will not be modified. And so as an example, if we move our player into our event zone, we now have an overlap. So now we'll update that game object and our width and height should not be 0. Once we move out of our game object, we no longer have an overlap. And because they don't intersect, our original game object will still have our width and height of what it was before. And so by resetting it, we'll make sure when we do our check, we'll be able to see if there's actually an overlap. And so to reset our game object, let's reference this. We'll do our rectangle overlap result. We're going to call set size. And now this will let us reset our width and height. And so we're going to just reset it back to 0. And now after we call this method here, we can now check our rectangle. And as long as our size isn't 0, 0, now we know there's an overlap. And so let's just do console.log, and we're going to log out our new rectangle. So we'll do this. We'll do our rectangle overlap result. All right, so if we refresh our browser, let's move our player into our rectangle. We should see right away our overlap result, our width and our height now matches the intersection of our player and our event zone. On our next iteration for our loop, for our second zone, since they're not overlapping, we reset our width and height back to 0, and that's exactly what we want. So now if we move out of our rectangle, we're going to see our width and height are updated. However, we have this bug where our height is still showing that there's an intersection. If we move further away from our rectangle, now we see it's reset and it's back to 0 for both of our game objects. So to fix this, what's happening is our player's shape, our rectangle for our shape, is still overlapping a little bit with our game object here. And to make it easier to see what's going on, we're going to go ahead and render out this third rectangle so we can see our overlap. All right, so to draw out our overlap result, we're going to use a graphics game object. And by using the graphics game object, we can provide one of our shapes and then use that to draw any shape to our canvas element. And we're going to want to keep track of this game object because we'll want to reset it between each of our checks. So then that way we can erase our overlap check. So to keep track of it, let's come up to the top of our class. We'll add a new property. And so for this property, we're just going to call it GFX. I'm going to copy our JS doc types real quick, paste that in. Now for our type, this is going to be a phaser game objects, and then it's going to be a graphics game object. Let's copy our property name. We'll come down to our init method. Let's reset it to undefined when we call our init method. So we'll do this. Our new property, we're going to set equal to undefined. Let's copy this, and now we need to create our game object. So at the bottom of our create method, right after we create our event zones, let's add a check to see if our debugging is enabled. So if our enable zone debugging is set to true, then we want to create this game object. So we're going to do this dot our graphics property is going to be equal to this dot add graphics. And now, so for our graphics game object, we can provide what kind of styling we would like to use when we draw out our shapes. So in our configuration here, let's do our line style, and we're going to do a width of 4 for 4 pixels. Now for our color, we're going to do 0x, 00, FF, FF. And so what this configuration will do is anytime we draw something to our graphics game object, this is going to be the default setting that's used for whatever we draw. So now that we have our graphics game object, if we come back down to our code for our event zones, we can now render out our result rectangle. All right, so now below our console log, let's make sure we have our debugging enabled. Then first we want to clear our graphics game object. We'll do this.graphics, we'll do clear. And now we want to draw out our shapes. We'll do this, our graphics game object, and we're going to do stroke. We'll do stroke rectangle shape. And now we can provide our geometry game objects. We'll do this, and we'll do our rectangle overlap result, and let's save. All right, so now we should be able to test our changes. If we come back to our browser, if we move our player into our event zone, we're going to see this little blue circle appear instead of our rectangle. And what's happening is in our for loop, since we reset our width and height and we don't have an overlap, that leaves our game object as this blue circle instead of our full rectangle. And so to fix this, we need to break out of our for loop once we do have an overlap between our player and one of our event zones. So to do that check, let's make a new variable, do const, and we're going to do is overlapping. We're going to set that equal to our rectangle overlap result, and we'll check our width value if our width is greater than 0 and our rectangle overlap result dot height is greater than 0. Then we have an overlap and we can break out of our loop early. So we're going to do an if statement. We'll do if is overlapping. If that's set to true, let's add a console log statement so we know which zone we overlapped with, and then we'll just break out of our for loop. So we'll do console.log, and let's do overlapping with zone. And now we're going to use that name property that we set on our game object. So let's do zone, and we'll do name. So now if we save, let's come back to our scene. Now what should happen is when we move our player into our event zone, we'll see we're breaking out of our loop, and now we can see that rectangle where we have that intersection. All right, so if we move our player outside of our event zone game object, we're going to see the issue we were seeing before where our player's game object is still overlapping with our event zone, even though we're trying to move our player away. And what's happening is our player's game object is currently bigger than one of our default tile sizes, and due to that, we have this much bleed over into our tile, and we'll need to account for that. And so one way to fix this is instead of checking to see if our width and height on our rectangle is greater than 0 when we set is overlapping, we can use the size of our tile, and if our width and height is greater than that value or equal to it, then we know our player is completely in our event zone, and that's a better check for our trigger. So to make that change, instead of doing greater than 0, let's do greater than or equal to, let's do our tile size. And so instead of just doing our tile size, let's just subtract a few pixels, and that way we have a little bit of padding in case our game object is smaller than our tile size. We're going to do the same thing over here, so we'll do our tile size, and we're going to subtract 10, and then let's also do greater than or equals to. Now if we come back to our scene, let's test our new logic. Now when our player moves into our event zone, we still see our blue rectangle for that overlap. And now when our player moves out, because our width and height don't meet our new criteria, we now reset it back to 0, and we continue our loop for checking for overlaps between our zones. All right, and just to make sure everything's working when we set our debug defaults, let's go over to our config file. Let's turn off our debugging. Now when we save our game, what should happen is our player should be in our world scene. We should still have our event zones, and then if we move through them, we'll see in our console log, we get our message about the zone that we're currently overlapping with. And just to make sure our logic's working, let's go over to event zone 2, and we'll see it's updated. It says overlapping with zone 2. Nice. So back in our code, let's turn back on our debugging, and we'll save. All right, so to quickly recap what we're doing here is for our player and our event zone game objects, we need a way to check for an overlap between our player and our rectangle shape that makes up our event zone. To do this, we're using a built-in utility method, phaser geometry intersect get rectangle intersection. This method allows us to provide our two rectangle shapes we want to check for an intersection with, and if there's an intersection, then this method can update a game object with the coordinates of the rectangle of that intersection. And so to make all this work, we need to create these geometry rectangle game objects, and we need to update their position and their dimensions to match the two game objects we want to check for positions with. To do that, we can use our getBounds method on our game objects, and this allows us to provide a geometry rectangle, and Phaser will update that rectangle to match the shape of our game object or our body, and it'll have the same X and Y position and the same width and height of our game object. By doing that, we can call that utility method, and then that's going to update all of our rectangles. And then finally, based on our overlap, we can just check the dimensions of our character, and as long as it's within our game object that we expect, our bounds, then we know we have a match, and this would be our trigger to start our cutscenes when we add in our code. Alright, and so before we wrap up, let's just clean up our code a little bit. Let's get rid of our console log here, and I'm just going to add in a little bit of spacing between our code, and then let's save. Alright, so for our game, I just want to make one more quick change. For our player, when our game starts, we want our player to actually be within our event zone, so then that way, as soon as our player moves, we can trigger our cutscene where our mom shows up to talk to our player. And currently, with our player outside our door, they can easily just avoid our event box, and we won't have the functionality that we're looking for. So we're going to update our player's starting position, and to do that, let's go into our data manager. Let's go up to our position for our player, and we'll update our X position. Instead of being 6, let's do 4. All right, so if we save and come back to our game, we'll need to clear our settings for our game. So in our developer console, if we do our local storage, and then we'll do clear, this is going to clear out all of our saved data, and now if we refresh our browser, our player should now be updated, and he should be outside of our house here. And so now once our player moves, this would now see that we have an overlap with our first zone, and now this will trigger our first cutscene. Alright, so those last changes, that brings this video to an end. In our next video, we're going to continue working on our cutscenes and in-game events feature, and we're going to start building out our data structure for our story events. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of this video to complete source code for this video, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see the links on your screen now.